Hello all. This is Reverie Roundtable, which we have Mondays, 8 p.m. Eastern. We have a fantastic group of individuals here. Very excited to be talking with them. Before we intro them, hey, if you're watching us on YouTube, consider hitting the like button. That thing's cool. Commenting on everything, right? Commenting on whether Bam's name is actually cool or not. Yeah, I think that's really important. We want to know what the people think, right? Though I think I already know. And hitting subscribe, right? Hitting that subscribe button. Also consider supporting the channel by becoming a YouTube member, hitting that join button, and supporting us that way as well. Okay, we'll start with Black American Made. Hey, buddy. How are you doing? Thanks for coming back. You were here with us, the other day. It was fun. You're dressed exactly the same, I think.
Hey, it's the same hat. Everything else is different. This hat is one of my go-tos. But no, everything's been super cool. Work is in a decent place right now, and I don't know, things are just looking up. Y'all can follow me at Black American Made on Twitter and YouTube. Also Twitch. I have the Twitch. I don't really use it, but it's a place you can follow me. And read One Piece. That's it.
Okay. Read One Piece. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Next, we'll go to Fabian Liberty. Scott. Scott is back with us to bring joy to leftist of the world around. So how are you doing?
I shit on the right just as much. Just your chat's probably not that familiar with it. Yeah, no, I'm doing great. Fabian Liberty, Anarcho-Capitalist Duo stream. Happy to be back. I'm Scott.
Yep, thank you. All right. Next we have Adam /Tap Dolphin. Top because Madeline's not here, so you're not bottom dolphin, correct? Right?
Yeah, that's how that one works.
Top Dolphin. Thank you for coming through. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. Intro. My name's Top Dolphin. I stream sometimes, but you can most check me on Prime panels. So, sub to Prime to Prime.
Hey, everyone here. Now look at Top Dolphin, right? Like, is his among the squares here, right? Is his room not the place where you expect a serial killer to be, right? Like all these places.
One more piano. Just one on the left, and then yeah, I completely believe it.
He needs one of those single light bulbs, right, swinging from the rooftop from the ceiling.
I can turn my light on and all.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
All right. We're serial killers today, boys and girls.
Just a lone mattress in the background. There's no bedding or anything. Just a mattress.
Yeah, like a bear concrete.
No, come on. It's still got the plastic on it.
True.
All right.
All of these boxes are part of my plans.
Well, thank you so much. Moving on to Lilac. Lilac Doll, who is brand new to this channel, but has been working with our friend Mad Latin, coming up again, and who recommended her to me. I'm very happy to meet her. Please tell myself and the world about you.
Hi, so my name is Lilac Doll. I am an adult content creator and a musician. I play songs on Twitch. I also co-host You Might Like This with Mad Latin, where every other week or so, one of us talks about something we're really passionate about that the other one doesn't know as much about. So we've got a video coming out about whether sex work actually increases human trafficking or not. So that's the kind of stuff I'm into.
We've argued about that like a dozen times here, right? Trafficking is not sex work, right? Slavery isn't the same as being an employee. All right. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm very excited to have you here. All right. Next we have Stardust. Right, excitement's dipping. Stardust, thank you for coming through here.
Why is the excitement dipping, Prime?
I'm just saying. Look, Stardust, we love you.
Because I fight. Okay, Prime. I thought that's what you wanted. Hi, everybody. I'm Stardust. I'm not going to be bullied by Prime today, okay? I came here prepared for this. You can find me on Twitch at twitch.tv/Stardust. I sometimes do research, I sometimes debate people, and sometimes I yell at people. It really depends on the day. Every Saturday, I host a show called Chaos Cast, where I try to throw off the panelists that I invite on as much as possible and make them feel as awkward as possible. It's super fun.
Except she never
Thank you
turns
for
that
having
off.
me.
She never ever turns that off. All right, thank you so much, Stardust, for that. We'll move on to the Duelist, who is new to the Reverie, but not new to the channel. We've had him on a few times on the open panel, and we've had some spirited debates. So I'm really happy that the Duelist is here. I had thought of you the other day. I'm like, why haven't I actually invited this person on? So I wanted to make sure to reach out this week. And I'm glad you said you accepted our invitation. The Duelist, tell the world about yourself.
Yeah, it's good. You know, I play video games. That's about what I do. Sometimes I look at some political stuff every now and then. I'm probably like a moderate, maybe slightly to the left of a moderate in most cases in kind of like American spheres. And yeah, that's about what I do. I used to stream on Twitch for a little bit, playing a game called New World by our overlords over at Amazon, but they kind of killed that game before it even released. So that's about what I do.
Thank you so much. All right. Next, we're going to Lonerbox. Lonerbox actually reached out to me like the other day. Said, yeah, I want to join in. I want to be a part of this. I'm like, cool. Here's an invite. So Lonerbox, thank you so much. Tell myself and the world about yourself.
Hey, I'm Stardust. You can find me on twitch.tv. Sometimes I debate people and I host a Chaos Cast. Hang on, that's the wrong script. Don't worry about that. I'm Lonerbox. I make YouTube videos and sometimes debate people. And I like short intros.
Okay, all right, okay. Excitement going up. All right, now we're going to Doobie, our Dark Lord and Savior, back with us again. All right, this man, he keeps me from being lonely, right? That's why he comes on all the time. Doobie, how are you?
I'm doing well, and I mean the reason I do that is I need to maintain my one black friendship, so I can like use you whenever people call me racist. I'm Doobie. I help run the politics server on Discord, the best and biggest politics server on the platform. And yeah, thanks for having me on.
Okay. All right, so let's get started. Let's get cracking. First topic. Militia culture has long been centered around defense against a powerful militarized force. Chiefly, this enemy force has been the American government. The criticism of that culture has been that it would be impossible to actually repel a serious offensive by a nation's military, especially the American armed forces. But as we watch Ukrainians actually contest against a military superpower, has militia culture been vindicated? If a militia had the honest goal of preparing to defend their local area or even the nation from an enemy, should we embrace that mission? Does it make sense to have armed groups such as this in the States, where an invasion is the least likely? Yeah, shout out to my counterpoints who helped me come up with this topic. It was actually really good, super interesting, and we haven't talked about, we've talked about militias before, but never in this way, right? So yeah, we've got an example of militias like doing the thing, right? Defending an area. I know I've made fun of like the whole idea of militia culture here on this channel many times. So I'm wondering, yeah, do you think this changes anything? All right, so we'll do opening statements. Bam is having a conversation, so we'll start with Scott.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. I'll be more interested to see like where it goes and where people take this. For me personally, my defense of militias is usually a moral argument about the right for them to exist as opposed to the effectiveness of them. I mean, I also don't really understand how this all of a sudden vindicates militias. Because obviously a few things, you know, it's not fully militias that are defending Ukraine, obviously, but also we have massive amounts of historical evidence to suggest that militia groups and thrown together armies in different nation states when dealing with superpowers are an effective means of self-defense. So I don't understand. Maybe it's because the left is so focused on the support of the Ukraine currently, and the political sphere, as far as the left is concerned, really doesn't pay attention to anything unless news media tells them it's okay to pay attention to it. And so maybe like they're finally getting some view of an idea that like militia groups and small arms and munitions are capable of self-defense. And if that is the case, I hope that it is. I hope that's a thing we can do moving forward. It would be nice to have the left on our side in terms of freedom.
Thank you so much. Bam?
Yeah, like the reality is militias at actually stopping militaries, no, militias don't work. Like the United States military could turn any area into dust anytime they chose to. The reason why militias are seem to work is because, like, one, there's an issue of like the government's wanting to actually occupy these areas, so they don't want all the infrastructure to be destroyed in the process. And number two, like when you're dealing with soldiers, you're not dealing with robots, so there is some level of human empathy that doesn't want to like roll the tank over someone's house with them, standing in it, because like, humans don't want to be seen as evil. But so yeah, to that degree, militias work, but realistically, no, militia can't stop the United States military from doing anything that it will want to do.
Top Dolphin.
Almost did the thing where I talked without unmuting myself. Yeah, I think that militia. I don't think this is like a really good example of militias doing a great job. I think the Russian invasion is like a half effort from Russia because they're trying to look good to the rest of the world and not just like roll through Ukraine. Like, if they actually just wanted to like take over Ukraine, like that wouldn't be a problem. But right now, their economy is absolutely crashing. I read like something that said that like they're losing like 30 years of progress because of this invasion. And a lot of times when countries have internal problems, those things aren't as bad. Like, for example, China doesn't see too much backlash from like the stuff they're doing with Uyghurs, right? I'm assuming if they wanted to like go to war with their citizens, which is like a weird concept that's probably never going to happen anyways, like the rest of the world wouldn't like crash their economy, even though maybe we should. I just think, and then from outside invasion, the United States isn't really in a place where like we're like really lucky geographically, and like the only place people can invade us from with current technology really is like Mexico or Canada. And yeah, that's never happening. So I don't think this is really a boon to militias, even though I think there's probably not that much wrong with militias existing. So
Thank you so much. All right, Lilac.
Yeah, I think that, I don't know, I'm kind of with Bam on when it comes to America, there's not a snowball's chance in hell that somebody with their guns and their bunker is going to be able to fight off the US military, and we're not likely to get invaded. So I just don't, and the other thing is, Ukraine isn't using militias. This is Ukrainian military and civilians being enlisted and like helping out with that. But it's not the same as a small collective of people deciding to independently fight against a state. So I don't think that this actually is a boon for militias.
Stardust.
I tend to agree with the other people on this panel. I'm not really sure that I understand the comparison. It's important to remember that the Ukrainian forces are being backed not only by the Ukrainian government, but by governments all around the world. The U.S. has been providing military-grade equipment to Ukraine for the purposes of fighting back, as have many other countries. And militias in the U.S. generally don't have the same level of backing. At least that a country in crisis would have, and recognized by the UN and all of that. Also, there's the difference in that the Ukrainian people are fighting alongside their government. It's not that they're fighting against their government; they're fighting alongside their government against an invading force. So I find it hard to imagine a scenario in which a militia in the United States is preparing to defend like a local area. If it is needed, I guess in anticipation of an event, I wouldn't necessarily be opposed, but again, we don't have the same amount of funding that like a country in crisis is getting globally. And while invasion may be least likely in the US, it's still important for me at least to uphold like personal liberty. So
Idealist.
Yeah, I think in the Ukraine, obviously, militia probably not a big thing to talk about. But on what Scott said, militias are unbelievably effective. Guerrilla warfare has won so many of the past wars against, maybe not against Russia, if you want to count the Second Chechen War against Russia. Kind of, maybe it was one, but they drew it out for 8 years. They wouldn't be able to occupy and hold Ukraine for 8 years with the current sanctions that they have. It won in Vietnam. It won in Afghanistan. Like, I'm sorry, but militias and guerrilla warfare is just really, really effective. And the reason why it's so effective is because we have something called a war crime. And what BAM says, America can just obliterate all the civilians and all of their buildings and all of their houses and all of the hospitals and all the schools and all the universities and everything in a country, they have the technical capability of doing that, yes, but it would be illegal, and it's not something that realistically we're going to see for a long time. When you're fighting militia in a town, they're going to hide in hospitals, they're going to hide in schools, and every time you bomb these people and try to take them out, which they did in Afghan, they've done many times in the Middle East with drone strikes, etc., that are very good at killing these people and not taking civilian casualties. Every time you miss a target, every time a drone strike goes wrong, it just completely destroys your morale and allows other people to recruit because they go, look at America. They bombed a school bus filled with 25 children and they all died. It's literally like playing tag with somebody who just timeouts every time you get close. It's not easy to fight guerrilla warfare. That's all I'm going to say on this. Oh, but if you're a nuclear superpower, it's cringe to have a militia because nobody's ever invading you.
Box.
I agree with what everyone said about Ukraine. Obviously, they're also an army that's got a lot of international support right now. I want to pick up maybe Scott and Duelist both said something quite interesting. There is actually quite a good book about this called Invisible Armies by a guy called Max Boot, which actually looks at all the insurgencies that fought against the United States since 1776. And it is true that militias and insurgencies have actually been more effective against the United States since the Second World War. But the reason he gives for that is because militias and insurgencies also tend to have more support from other international superpowers. So Duelist, you said Vietnam and Afghanistan. Well, Vietnam, the insurgencies there had support from the Soviet Union and China and like pretty big powers. And Afghanistan have had the sanctuary and this constant support of Pakistan, which is a nuclear power. So I think that's maybe the reason that the success rate of militias has gone up recently. It's still like not great, but yeah, they definitely have some level of effectiveness. I think if you're in the United States, then I guess the only justification for it would be that people in the US run around with guns anyway. So you might as well cultivate a culture of like militia behavior that's disciplined and controlled. So yeah, why not?
Okay, go ahead. Tibby, please.
So I'm not a military strategist outside of like the Total War video games, but my understanding is that the reason Russia's had so much trouble taking Ukraine is they were just caught off guard by the amount of resistance they received. And I think like no matter how many change.org petitions are signed, no matter how many anti-tank missiles the U.S. Sends Ukraine to whittle down our rivals' supply of tanks, it seems like Russia's victory is inevitable as like more resources are shifted toward the war effort. That isn't to say that the militia groups there haven't helped. Of course they have. But I think given how common it is for militia groups across the planet to rise up and lead revolts against the governments across this planet, for everything from like political to religious to tribal differences, it seems like the core issues that I have with militias aren't really addressed by the Ukraine situation. So no, we shouldn't support militia groups in the United States. I think we should continue the slow march toward restricting gun privileges and removing instruments of war from the civilian population.
Okay. So the sources I've seen, have said like Ukraine, like before the war, actually armed militias and created new ones. My understanding is that yeah, I mean militias are actually a part of this. I mean they've been obviously working with the army, but just putting that out there. But yeah, all right, let's jump into this. Open to the panel.
So how are we defining militias by that case? Like would the National Guard be considered a militia?
No.
In the same.
So after the 2014 what was it, Crimean invasion, Ukraine actually did incorporate some militia groups like the Azov Battalion that everybody's so pissed off about into their National Guard, right? So that wasn't the only militia group they did this for, right? So they brought in some of the militia groups that existed and made them part of their formal military in a way. So yeah, I mean militia groups are definitely part of this.
Okay. The other thing I was curious about the Duelist brought up, like I'm noticing like a big overlap between guerrilla warfare and militias, and I see the comparison, but I don't think that they're necessarily one and the same. Like I think you can have an organized military that uses guerrilla warfare tactics, But actually, what I want to talk about was the war crime thing. Like, I think war crimes are obviously a real thing from a morale perspective, but who's going to who actually checks like major nuclear superpowers whenever they commit war crimes? Like, who does anything? Like, you can say it's bad, but what are the consequences?
Oh, I mean, the
Probably
real issue
really, really
is,
bad sanctions, right?
I mean,
If
the
you're
real
committing
issue
war
is that
crimes.
Russia's always on the Security Council, right? So they're obviously going to get more leeway in this situation than, let's say, another power that isn't currently sitting on the Security Council.
You could also argue that one of the problems with war crimes is you actually get backlash just in that, depending on what you're trying to do, you turn more and more people against you. So one of the things was that under the Trump administration was that they got rid of the rules of engagement when it came to airstrikes and I think landmines. And the result was that the number of civilian deaths by the pro-Afghan government forces, including the US, had like doubled. So for the Taliban, that was like brilliant. We're going to recruit like a lot more people based on these atrocities. So yeah, like I think there can actually be backfire as well when it comes, if you're trying to win like civilian support. It's very important to like not commit war crimes.
Yeah, I mean, anytime. I mean, I think we're honestly, I think we're mostly in agreement here, with the exception of Doobie. But that's Doobie. But I think this idea that militias can't do anything against the United States is something I wanted to talk about. One of the things I want to talk about, Lonerbox. I appreciate your research, right? I appreciate that comparison. The problem I have with the comparison that you draw, that the reason militia groups are successful is probably more likely because they had outside support. I'm having a struggle imagining a scenario where you wouldn't likely have some outside support in any engagement where a superpower is invading another country, right? I mean, the success of those, I mean, I'm trying to imagine a scenario in my head where a superpower goes to war and it doesn't piss off some other countries that have ideological or economic interests that go against that superpower, be it America, be it Russia, right? So while I do kind of agree with you to some extent that without any financial backing or without any funds or resources or public outcry, the militia is likely not able to go toe to toe with a superpower. It just seems like a kind of a comparison, like a distinction without a difference, because I just don't see how that would occur. I mean, can you imagine one? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's because that data was taken from 1776 onwards. So a lot of this involved involvement in colonial areas where there was just not as much, at least not as much support as groups like Vietnam and Afghanistan get now, right? So it's
no, I appreciate that. I'm good with that. I'm talking about in the modern context. Could you?
Oh yeah, in the modern context,
imagine a superpower going to war with a small nation and then them getting zero support.
Oh yeah, definitely.
You have
I don't think
kind
so.
of like
so
sideways
if I can,
example.
if I can chime in here, in regards to if we're talking about the U.S. itself, right? Is the scenario you're looking for within the with the U.S. Within the U.S. having a U.S. militia, Scott?
Like a civil war?
Well, no, I'm engaging with Lonerbox's point specifically. That would be talking about something else, right?
Okay.
But he was talking about how it's more likely the fact that other powers are feeding them and funneling them and giving them supplies that makes them successful and being able to do hit and run tactics. And my question is, can we really imagine a scenario in the modern context where a superpower invades a small nation to the point where they're using militia and hit and run tactics in order to survive, where they're not getting at least some economic, financial, or ideological support?
Well, for example, if it's the U.S. that that has the militias and that is being invaded by another country that's large, we're already the strongest military, right? So I'm sure other countries would contribute, but I don't know how much assistance that would be, right?
So
I mean,
we
we've
actually
already
have
brought
a
up
pretty
we've already
good
brought up-
example of
Yeah,
this.
We've already
right?
brought up Afghanistan, right? And so, I mean, I mean, Afghanistan maybe is something different. You know, I think we kind of all remember or know or have heard at least one point the Alexander the Great quote. You know, may God keep away the venom of the cobra, the teeth of the tiger, and the revenge of the Afghans. Like no one's ever been able to take over Afghanistan.
Never heard
In
of that.
all in all
Well,
of
I mean,
world
I'm trying to
history.
engage with
Not
what
even
you're
once.
saying about like, but I'm trying to engage with what you're saying in the modern sense. If we're talking about the U.S. and we're talking about the militias in the U.S. and somehow the U.S. being invaded, I'm just saying like we are the strongest military power, right? How much is
Yeah.
another country's contribution going to help us?
Yeah, so in response to like Lona Box's response to me, talking about this book that you read, I think that a great critique of what you brought up was we do actually have an idea of a big superpower going to war, basically, against funding from the US. Now, this massive superpower with an unbelievable army was actually able to overthrow the US's support in this region, and even without any other backing. Does anybody remember where this was? This was in the Cuban Revolution, and Fidel Castro was actually able to overthrow the government that was supported by the US military. And the US military armed them with tanks, machine guns, bazookas, and training. And even a military as small as the rebel forces in Cuba were able to overcome that using guerrilla tactics. So I think that it does go to show that if you had a stronger military like the US, just giving some funding it isn't the reason why they're going to be overthrown. It's actually just guerrilla tactics being incredibly effective.
I would need more details for that. Like it would, because I mean, it's possible that everything you said is true, but that doesn't go as far as like I mean, I don't have the research to say like how bad did they really want it? Because I'm like, are you telling me that the United States couldn't like it wanted to keep Cuba, they just wouldn't have the ability? I'm like, I have no idea.
And
we
with those
we
guerrilla-
just pulled out of 20 years of failing in Afghanistan. Like
Yeah,
we literally just left
and we
20 years shit
never
show
won
that
it.
we could never fucking control.
But do you think do you think that the United States couldn't have stayed in Afghanistan for another 60 years if they felt like it? If we just yawned to say, you know what, why not? Absolutely.
Because
What's
it's
the
not
point of
politically
bringing up guerrilla warfare versus militias?
Because the way that militias generally act in combat is through guerrilla warfare. They generally don't go out into a big field and wait for a big line or column of tanks to come at them and then bazooka them down the street.
But
or
a lot of
in a field
militaries
somewhere.
engage in guerrilla warfare as well, right?
They do indeed, but the idea of militia is that it's easier to enlist people, it's easier to train people because they don't have that much training, and it's easier to supply people as well. When you're engaged in an actual official military, it's a lot easier to deal with those people than it is to deal with militia.
Lilac?
So I'm curious. I'm curious about, in the case of Cuba, do we know if the guerrilla warfare and the militias were using weapons that the United States had sent over there? Because in that case, that is a form of support, even though it was on the opposite side.
No, they didn't send any support to the.
They didn't support the militias. But if they were sending weapons over there and then those weapons were appropriated, wouldn't that have had an impact on guerrilla warfare?
This idea is like saying that everyone is supported by Russia because people use AK-47s.
No, but if you're trying to find an example that didn't use external international support, you can't discount the raw materials that weapons on, no matter who supplied them, will be useful and are in some ways they're substantive. They change the nature of the fight from just guerrilla warfare and militias to guerrilla warfare and militias and weapons.
But we're providing the active government with.
How are militias supposedly easier to supply? Who made that claim?
Well, easier than what? I guess maybe.
I don't know who made the claim that they're easier to
supply. The reason why they use guerrilla warfare is because it's harder to supply them, right?
I don't know anyone who made the claim that it's easier to supply them.
Yeah, if anything, it's supply themselves.
There's some
I don't think
things
you were
that
the
are
one who
easier
brought
to
that
give
up,
to a militia.
Lilac. I think it was somebody else who brought it up.
It was the duelists, which
Oh,
I
the
mean, you
duelists?
bring your own guns
There's
usually.
another
Yeah,
that's
there's
what it is.
another advantage that
It's
we're not
guns.
discussing here, right? And I think a good example of this is while it's not we're not talking about militia forces, obviously, right? But we can talk about the Civil War and the home field advantage, right? One of the reasons for the successes of the military successes in the first few years of the Civil War of Robert E. Lee was obviously that he was a brilliant strategist and that he knew all of the generals personally, like psychologically. But I mean, they were undermanned. They had, they had way less manufacturing. They had superior cavalry in the beginning. But one of the big advantages that they had in fighting the Civil War was that with the exception of a few battles where Lee pushed forward in an attempt to gain foreign support from England to try and break the kind of the Anaconda Plan blockade, with exception of those battles, almost all of the battles were fought in Virginia. And the fact of the matter is that the local population, on their own home field advantage, knew the terrain, knew certain ideas better. They understood certain. They were helpful, right? Like so, the North would get bad information from locals. They wouldn't understand the mountain terrain or what it took to engage in certain activities. What easier passes would be easier, things like that. And that is when talking about a militia that is defending a local area. That is something that also you have to take into account that I think adds to the idea of guerrilla warfare. It is more difficult for a large force to engage in guerrilla warfare tactics. One, because they're large, but two, because they usually don't have the same access to information of the local terrain that a local militia has. A local militia knows how to come through a quick mountain pass, bunny with the enemy forces, drop a few bombs, and then dip back into a pass and into another area. And they know that if they go a mile this way, they'll avoid the entire swamp, right? So like that's kind of part of why we're discussing guerrilla warfare tactics, is because a large force doesn't have the same capacity to engage in guerrilla warfare that smaller militias do.
I think
Larger forces often split into smaller forces, though, like so they can engage in those. It's not like that. Just because there's a larger force doesn't mean that they don't have tactics where they split into smaller forces and engage in guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, but by splitting into smaller forces, they also lose some of their advantage that they have against small local militias, right? If you're splitting into smaller forces to fan out over a giant area because you're trying to stop the guerrilla warfare tactics that are occurring, what you're doing is splitting up your forces into smaller places that can actually be more of a fair fight for local militia, and they can win those engagements, right? And so, I mean, like, obviously there's a lot of strategy that goes into a lot of things here, but the idea is that a local population tends to know their terrain better, which makes it easier to engage in guerrilla warfare.
But I think that what's happening here, though, is that we're talking about militias as if they have like they are inherently going to be more able to use guerrilla warfare when if there's a local military force, they can use guerrilla warfare too. There's no like specific advantage, right?
Just because you haven't said anything against the arguments that I've made, though.
I have.
He's specifically saying.
So the idea is that.
So I'm trying to help you out a little bit here, Scott. So what he's saying is that specifically they'll know their terrain, right? So guerrilla warfare is more.
A local military can know their terrain too.
Well, if you understand how the National Guard works, here's the problem. If you understand how the National Guard works, right? You have a bunch in America, for example, right? You have a ton of people throughout the region that have their guard duty station, and let's say Fort Lee. We'll use Virginia as an example, right? So they all go to Fort Lee on the weekends. Now, this is people in Petersburg. This is people that live in Richmond. This is people that live in all of the rural counties surrounding the Tri-City areas. This is people south. This is people in Williamsburg. This is like a third of the fucking state, right? Are all coming in for an hour, 2 hour, or sometimes 4 hour drive to this one military installation to do some weekend training, right? So in the American context, when we're talking about a local militia in like a full scale invasion, this would be like Cumberland County, right? This would be a small group of people that know their area and know their woods. These are people that hunt in these woods, right? These are people that live in this local community. So this idea of like a local army versus a local militia, there's a difference in the way that those things are
Well, I
structured.
mean, then like the person in charge would just ask people, "Hey, does anybody know the terrain in this one area?" And then whoever does, then they give them the intel on that, right?
Well, I mean,
If
I
only
assume you wouldn't
command
be able to
structures
pass
were
it.
that fucking beautifully well organized. Like that's
Is that the only
shit
rebuttal that
show.
you have? If only command structures were that
My
not
rebuttal,
fucking structured
my
unit.
rebuttal is that as someone that's been in the military before, you have no idea what a shit show command structures are and how difficult it would be to actually
You
do
don't
that,
think
and how
in
many
like
ego
a
people wouldn't
you
listen
don't think
to that.
like in a heated environment, the best military in the world, the best military, the strongest military in the world couldn't handle doing local things and communicating in a direct way to each other.
I mean, I think that I'm on your side, and I don't think that they'll ever be able to, like, you can't. I don't think you can fake knowing the area that you live in. I don't think you'll ever be
You
able
don't
to
have
like.
to fake it. There will be
I'm
people
saying,
who are
sure.
from that area.
Sure,
who
but I'm
can-
saying,
who
but
can
those
take lead
few
in that
people
area.
but they'll never be able to, like, the entire squadron, like, that they're a part of, even if you split them up, aren't going to be able to navigate just because you have a leader that knows the area. Like, I still don't. Like, you're never going to be equal to the people, like, everyone on this side lives in.
Right,
the
you have
Well,
what you're
I mean,
comparing. Listen, what you're
yes,
comparing. No, listen,
you
what you're
can, though.
comparing. Listen, what you're comparing is you're comparing, like, let's say the National Guard, because we're using the American
You
context,
already
right?
did this whole.
Right.
Oh my god, dude.
Oh
We
my
already
god!
did
Oh my!
this.
I'm trying to make it easier so that you can understand, right? You're comparing the National Guard unit that in, let's say, Cumberland County, right? And you've got 2 weekend warrior people that couldn't cut it in active duty that supposedly might know the area versus a bunch of fucking rednecks in a militia that hunt and fish in these goddamn areas every damn weekend of their life and are in a militia group. The local knowledge that is going to be present in a militia group that is in a local area versus a National Guard unit is monumentally different. And
So
if
I
you can't
have
see
a
that,
question.
like,
Just
I have a
to be
question.
clear,
technical
hold on.
advantage
Not
to
all
know.
fucking
Like-
National Guard people are weekend warriors, right? There's full time like reserve or National Guard. Like
there's
that-
activated National Guard, but
Here's what I want to know. I want to know what you guys think would be more effective. A few locals who happen to know their area for their own recreational purposes, who are not military strategists, or a team of dedicated navigational satellite analysts whose only job is to look at satellite imaging, thermoradiation maps, whatever technology we have, to say, hey, this is what the area is, this is what you need to do, this is where you need to go, and have training and skills in how to communicate that effectively. That's going to be less effective than people who know how to hunt and fish in their local backyard. Is that what you're arguing?
Honestly, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
No, I
Like,
disagree. I
no,
disagree.
yeah,
I'm
so
with Lilac on this one.
Okay,
I think
so
it's also-
I wanted
it's
to
just made
it sound
put in a few things here, and I want to work off of Lilac's point. Okay, so, and again, this is a person who's been historically against militias, but the advantage of arming a militia group, right? Like the advantage of that, rather than armoring just regular citizens, but Ukraine's done both, right? The militia groups and regular individuals, is that militias actually, they train, right? They train with weapons, they're familiar with them. If you look at videos of Ukrainians who volunteered, they didn't know how to use weapons, right? like a lot of them said, this is my first time using a gun. It was a guy who was like, I'm going to Google how to shoot, right? There's a big difference between arming that and even a loose group of people in some sort of unit who like train regularly, right? Dick around in the woods doing whatever the fuck, right? That is qualitatively different. And going to and one, I also don't like the idea that like the U.S. it's impossible to invade the U.S. It's like a side thing, right? Like that thing will never happen. So I put that aside. But in any case, I again, as a person who is not really in favor of militias in general, like it's a different thing to have personal knowledge of the area. I think a different thing to know the contours. of the topography, right? Whether it be in an urban area and or like in the woods, right? Like to actually know like where a bend is, right? Where you could like maybe hide, to know where you can get the high ground, the low ground, all those things, right? Like it's different to knowing it than being told, hey, this is what you should be looking out for, right? By a person because they're looking at satellite imagery. It's a different thing to have like a blueprint of a building and like going off of that to actually having been in that building like 20 times and then knowing like having the reaction speed of like I'm going to jump into this room rather than the other one. I think like that experience is actually quite useful. So I don't think it can be replicated.
I'm not.
I think I can clear this
I'm not
up
against militias.
really easily.
I'm not against militias. I just think that it's a little bit disingenuous to imply that there's all of this advantage to having a militia over the military that's locally
Luckily, no one did that.
stationed.
Luckily, no one did
That's
that.
That's kind of
No,
what
we're
was
trying to
implied.
explain to you why guerrilla warfare is something
Guerrilla
that is
warfare
pertinent
is
to
used
talking
by
about.
the military too.
No, what we're trying to
Let-
explain
let
to you is that you can have a military and you can have a militia, and we think the two of these things is better than one.
Yes.
Sure.
But
That's
the
fine.
grounds you're
let me give
arguing
a
it on
story.
don't
So
actually
then you're
follow.
arguing that militias are
Okay,
good.
okay,
Yeah,
so-
Because
what
people
we're-
who
that-
are in
you guys are
doesn't-
talking
militias
about
that doesn't
like
relate.
militias are this magical thing that like they have so many advantages and they're so much more adept at using guerrilla warfare.
Okay,
When
no,
really that's not the
no,
case.
No, I
Sorry,
think the
you're
argument is
blowing out
more
of proportion.
against because this is important, right? Like the question I set out is it good to have a militias? Like, would it make sense to have these armed groups within your territory, right? The other option is to not have armed groups and have completely like well, maybe not unarmed
kind of
civilian
got away from
populace,
that.
but just like a not an organized civilian populace, right? So that's what you're talking about, saying that like we're gonna like banning of militias rather than having militias, and then whether militias would be useful in some sort of armed conflict, right? Not rather than militias might be more useful than an organized military.
Let me.
I guess
can
it
clear
depends
this
on
up.
what
Hold
kind
on,
of-
no,
That's not
let-
what it
let me-
sounded
let me
like.
just- Let me just clear.
What it sounded
Let me
like
just
to
clear
me.
this up with an
is-
actual real world example.
I-
Let me just
it-
clear this up with an actual
I
real world
understand
example.
what you're saying. I think
I
it's
don't think
just
you do,
that
but it's okay. We're gonna move on.
I just think that.
Stardust.
Wait a
holding us
minute.
back.
Hold on,
Please.
Stardust, go, and then you after, right?
Yeah, I get it. I'm very frustrating, but I'm just trying to like explain. If this had just been a conversation about whether a militia could be useful, I mean possibly, but like to me it sounded like the conversation turned from the utility of having a militia to like talking about guerrilla warfare as if it's something that only a militia uses and only a militia has the advantage of using and is so much more advantage than a local
my God.
military group, when a military group in general, like in my opinion, has more funding and has more training a lot of the time. That's just the gist of it. Like
Okay,
that's it.
so,
Well,
so first of
I'm
all-
sorry,
no,
but
no,
when I
no,
came into this
hold on, let me-
discussion, I thought that you had like read what the discussion was about, or like slightly understood the
Oh, I
question.
did
Real
read
quick,
about
no,
what the
let-
discussion
please
was
let me
about,
just
but we
fix
got off
this.
topic.
No, let me just fix this.
I don't
So,
think you
two
will.
things. First of all, people keep making the claim that militaries use guerrilla warfare tactics all the time. No, they fucking don't. It's rare. In American military, sometimes the Cav Scouts kind of do that, and it's usually because the Cav Scouts fucked up. Rangers don't do that. They just go forward to set up forward operating bases. When you have massive fucking armies, that's what you fucking do. You move forward, you set up FOBs, you then build on the FOBs with the fucking CBs, and then you do route clearance and missions outside of the fucking FOBs. Guerrilla warfare tactics are not done by large militaries, by and large. Does it happen sometimes? You have like green berets and shit? Yeah, sure. Like,
But
do
that's
they
also
go?
but that's also because we don't
but
have conflict
second-
on American soil, right?
Okay,
Like this
well,
would be
that's
completely
not-
different if we're having conflicts on American soil. Like
This is
like,
true, but
obviously
but
if we
no,
go
but Top,
overseas,
let me-
we're not going to be
let-
using
let-
guerrilla tactics.
Fair enough. Okay. We may change our tactics to some degree if we're invaded, right? But anybody pretending like they know what that would look like anyways is kind of talking out of their ass, because the world would have to change dramatically for America to be invaded by a meaningful force. But otherwise, two quick examples, right? in France, right? After France was taken over by Germany, one of the things that the French resistance did while they were occupied is they would take their chinaware, their dinner plates, right? And they would put them on the streets upside down and cover them up with a little bit of dirt. This would slow the German force down and stop their ability to engage in blitzkrieg massively, because they could not distinguish whether or not those china plates or those dinner plates were landmines or if they were just plates. And so they constantly had to shift their troop movements, and it slowed them down massively. And if they got out to check these things, they would probably be killed by sniper fire. Second, when my dad got back from his first tour early in the Iraq invasion, right? One of the things that he talked about all the time was that in the beginning, it was very difficult for him to ascertain where IEDs were because he drove trucks in and out of Baghdad. And what he eventually learned was that there was these little local codes that people were using in the area where they would put a specific type of can on the side of the road. And that specific type of can, not a different can, would let people know that there was an IED planted in the road designed to kill American soldiers. What we're talking about is when you're
examples that you're giving are offense versus defense, not militia versus military. If you're being invaded,
we're talking the entire context of the conversation is militias defending local
but
areas.
you're trying to defend militias on the grounds that they have certain abilities, but all of the abilities that you've attributed to militias are just abilities that are the default of being invaded and defending a land, not necessarily that it's a militia.
And nobody's arguing that guerrilla warfare isn't effective. That's another thing. You're bringing these stories up as if we're saying that guerrilla warfare isn't effective. No, it is effective.
I just don't think the reason I think we're having this conversation is because I initially said that, like, even with guerrilla warfare and all these tactics, like, I don't think you could stop the U.S. military from doing whatever the U.S. military wanted to do. Like, from perspective, even with the even with guerrilla warfare. If we're talking about
the Ukraine perspective, if we're talking about something similar, then it would most likely be the United States Armed Forces and whatever civilian forces and whatever local militias working together.
So, all right, I want to try to advance this a bit, but I think one thing is clear. Bam, right? You're saying stop the U.S. military from doing whatever it wants to do. It depends on actually what the U.S. military wants to do. If it just wants to, like, wipe out a force, right? Like, just, like, seriously wipe everything out, well, then yes, tactical nuke, right? Like, you could just, like, go to that level if you wanted. But if you wanted to take control of the area, right? Yeah. And, like, have like a city left, right? Well, then you'd have to go through and clear out the enemy rather than, you know, just obliterating everything. So, I mean, I think that actually matters. And if that's the case, if that's what you're dealing with, they want to hold territory, well, then they're going to use different tactics and you have a chance to actually engage them. Doobie had his hand up a while ago. So, yeah.
Yeah, I first of all, I agree with Stardust. I think we're like way off topic, but that's okay. I think that if we're talking about the point at which, like, we're engaging in, like, guerrilla tactics on U.S. soil, lots of people in these militia groups are probably going to be U.S. soldiers, right? Whose command structure's fallen apart, and now they're part of some local group, right, trying to fight off the invaders or whatever the fuck. And I think that when you have militia groups like the Oath Keepers, like the 3%ers, whatever the fuck, with their conflicting command structures, and trying to organize groups like that and try to figure out who's in charge, who gets to make the calls at the local level during one of these conflicts would actually confuse things, make it more difficult to organize like operations against an enemy that's on U.S. soil, right? And let's be real, most people who are in militia groups are like veterans with PTSD and shit who can't be in the military, and they've got like a hero complex, so they run around the woods and get drunk on weekends with a friend, right? These aren't like professional level soldiers that we're talking about, right? So I don't know, I feel like we're massively overstating the capability of these militia groups, and I think that even if they are effective, right? I think that if the U.S. government wanted to turn on militia groups in the United States, if there was some kind of an uprising, they'd get totally decimated, right? And I think that all these people, like, speaking about their ability to fight against like a more traditional army, if you were talking about the U.S. Government and the U.S. Army, right, that's actually pretty fucking scary. I don't want effective militia groups full of like right-wing extremists fighting against the government, right? I think this is just like helps the case for taking away their weapons.
Well, I
Okay,
mean,
so
I
to
think that
summarize
also.
everything so far, what I'm hearing is
We ask you to
local
summarize everything.
local
Yeah, no, thank you.
local armies are somehow able to engage in guerrilla warfare, hiding within the population and engaging in militia style tactics better than militias. Militias are full of just a bunch of larpers, so they're bad. But I'm not hearing any evidence or any historical analysis or anything
What do you think we're disagreeing with?
supports anything what we're saying.
What do you think we're disagreeing with here?
Here we go. I will make the point, since you have already made the point, but you haven't backed up the point, which is that militias aren't
We've been
effective.
backing things up. You
Okay,
it's
Right?
not
So
working
I will
for
make
you.
the opposite.
What do you mean? What do you mean
Militias
by
are
effective? What do you mean by
Based on-
effective?
Of defending the local area.
Okay.
And that
So
that
can you
is-
acknowledge that if the United States were to, like, even in Iraq, we saw this in Iraq, right? When Iraq was invaded, a lot of the quote unquote militias there, the militia members there, these like unorganized groups doing guerrilla warfare, were actually Iraqi soldiers who were in the military and surrendered. Right when the military surrendered, they kept fighting. Right, so these
Okay.
weren't people that were like on the weekend crawling around in caves in the fucking desert. Right, these are professional soldiers.
How is
I
that
don't know,
any
like,
different than any other
So I
militia
don't
group?
understand. It's
So
not.
again, you've got nothing.
It's not. It's not that different, right? Nobody's disagreeing that if an invasion of a country happens, guerrilla warfare can be effective. We're saying that if in the case of the United States or right now Russia, right, invading a country, militia groups are not going to save Ukraine, right? Militia groups will not save the United States if fucking China and Russia teamed up to invade us or whatever the fuck happens, right? So like I think we're massively overstating the capabilities. And if their capabilities were anything near what you're saying, it's more like adds to the fuel that I have to take away the weapon.
I think
Okay.
also just like I think maybe a lot about the dispute is just that like I personally don't think like militias or just like guerrilla warfare doesn't give you an advantage. I mean, like even before states could provide help to militias and insurgencies, like they still had a reasonably high success rate. So I think it's just that like it's very contextual depending on what country you're thinking about. So even with Cuba, like yes, they were using guerrilla tactics, which Batista wasn't, but then they also enjoyed like quite a lot of popular support, whereas Batista was a very corrupt government that no one believed in, including a lot of his soldiers. Not to mention that like Castro from like quite early on had support from like other Latin American countries,
Also,
and then obviously
Batista
before Bay of
lost
Pigs, it
support
was
from America. So like by the
yeah,
time
yeah, and then
you didn't
before,
have
and then
support.
like yeah, and then like what like before Bay of Pigs, like the Soviet Union were involved. So yeah, it's like quite that's why it's very contextual, especially like almost like every like successful like militia overthrow or like insurgency like in Africa, for example, like whether it's Sierra Leone or Liberia or Congo or Mozambique, like these it's usually accompanied by like state failure happening at the same time. So I think like yeah, you can of course like guerrilla warfare is like quite well recognized. I don't know if anyone's disagreeing with that. I think it's just more that like there's a romanticization that goes around militias and like it's almost like parallel to the noble savage thing that people find a bit cringy. But I think that that's just what I'm thinking is going on here.
Yeah, I have no issue
when
in
I think
general
of-
with. Oh, you can go.
Yeah, when I think of militias, I'm thinking of ways to like defend your country. Okay, now I think there are 3 ways to defend your country in order, right? Getting nukes. Okay, that's really, really good. People don't invade people with nukes. We make it pretty illegal for people to get nukes. We make it very, very hard for people to get nukes because we don't want other people having nukes. But you can't really invade someone with nukes. People keep saying we don't know what an invasion of the US would look like. The invasion of the US would look like whoever is invading them getting nuked, and probably that other superpower nuking us as well. Unless we make some kind of advancements in military that we can actually get rid of, 100% of the nukes that are shot up by other people. If you can't do that, okay, you enter a defensive pact with a nuclear power. You do something like NATO. You enter the EU. You do UCAS. You enter the CSTO. Like any of these things, right? Any of these defensive pacts with nuclear powers are really, really good for defending your country, because then a nuclear power is going to fuck with anybody who fucks with you. And thirdly, you don't have nukes. You don't have a defensive pact with a superpower. What happens if someone just comes into your country, rolls over your government, rolls over your army? What do you have to defend yourself after that? You need to have militia groups, and you need to have armed civilians. If you want to make it difficult to occupy your country, this is the last resort that you have. And you've got mutually assured destruction in nuclear weapons, or with militia groups and armed civilians, You just have assured destruction. You're not doing anything to the other people, but you're saying, hey, if you want to take our shit and occupy us, this is going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. And by the end of it, our entire country is just going to look like a war zone. If you want to stay here for 30, 40, 50 years, fine. But this country is going to be a war zone for 30, 40, 50 years.
I have a question. Would nukes prevent like an armed uprising within the country?
A civil uprising? Probably
Yeah,
not.
something like that.
I mean, if they were okay nuking their citizens, but I'd hope that would never happen.
I feel like that would probably just make the situation worse.
I feel like
Depends on what they
that's
want.
the largest context we like when we talk about militias. I get like this question came in reference of Ukraine, but generally speaking, when Americans talk about militias, they always talk about like combating the like an internal warfare, like combating the U.S. government.
Which I actually had a question for Scott. You mentioned all these things that the U.S. military doesn't do. The military doesn't use guerrilla warfare tactics, and I feel like that also leads to the argument that guerrilla warfare is what you do when you don't have another option. Because like the duelist was saying, you will be at war for 30 to 50 years and suffer great loss and damage because of it. And if you want, like if you're in the US and you are counting on guerrilla warfare and militias to save you, you have to have an adequate and accurate picture of what that actually entails. Because if you just say, oh, well, they're good because they're special and they're local, you're not going to stand any chance to even last 30 to 50 years.
Well, I mean, I don't know where you're getting the idea that you're not going to have any chance to last 30 to 50 years, but
if you don't know what you're working with, like if you're uninformed, you will lose very quickly.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, the my channel name literally comes from the invention of guerrilla war, right? As a military strategy. Fabian Liberty comes from the Fabian Society, comes from the General Fabius, and he was the first general to defeat Hannibal Lecter because he understood that he could not fight Hannibal Lecter in a fight one-on-one. And I'm sorry, not Hannibal Lecter. I don't know why I keep saying Hannibal Lecter. I'm from Carthage, Jesus.
Let's keep going there.
Oh, sorry,
Alps,
no,
yeah.
Hannibal. Sorry,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, dude. But I got serial killer night tomorrow.
But why doesn't the U.S. Army
Right.
use guerrilla warfare if it's and militias if they're so good?
Well, because guerrilla warfare is a defensive tactic for the most part, right? Like you're not occupying territory when you're engaged in guerrilla warfare. I mean, guerrilla warfare is based upon the idea that you're not gonna instead of. So to go further with the example against Hannibal, Fabius he burned all of the crops, right, as he was leaving, because Hannibal thought he could come in, take areas, and then refuel and give food and everything to his soldiers. And Fabius knew he's got a supply line that has to go through the Alps, right?
Okay,
and
so
if we engage in this, we can make it too expensive for this larger, superior, better armed, better equipped
Interesting,
military
but I don't know why we're getting
to
like
be
a history
able to.
lesson.
So guerrilla. The reason why we don't use guerrilla warfare usually is because it's a defensive tactic, right?
Usually, I mean, like I said,
that's why we don't use it.
Sometimes we engage.
It's not like the American army can't use it. I'm sure they can. If we're in a defensive position, then they will use it.
Again, the Green Berets all the time touch down with language experts and train local militia forces to be able to.
The invasion of the U.S. though, right?
Yeah, well, if
they can train people how to do it, then they can train our people how to do it, right? I mean,
there's nothing special about the local militias then if they're able to be trained.
There's nothing special.
If someone invaded the U.S. and they overthrew the president, then they'd have the commander of the army.
That you can't even understand what I just said.
The
Green Berets trained the local militia to be better, right? The Green Berets don't become the local militia, right?
But they still use outside training.
Right, but they train people that have knowledge and have a structure and have local area knowledge. They train the local population because sometimes that's more effective and cheaper than actually going in and bringing in an invasion force.
It's definitely cheaper. I mean, like the biggest benefit of why they, like the United States didn't want to originally have like a long-standing military, just wanted to use militias, is because it's way more affordable. Hey, bring your own gun. Bring your own, bullets, whatever. Like, we'll do some training once a week, and like, it basically we have our military without having to fund the military.
I agree with that point, because one of the earlier points made in this conversation, for whatever reason, was that that local militias are easier to supply. They're clearly not. They have to use their own equipment, and they still need training, right? And you don't have to pay them. So.
I don't know, but I think militias
Yeah,
are
I never
generally
made that
cool
argument.
though.
I
Because I'm
don't
in favor
think
of
there's
the
a good.
because I'm big in favor of like I think the Black Panthers like initially started out like I think by every argument you can make there's some form of militia, at least in their origination. So and they did a lot of good for the communities. So I think militias definitely have their place. I think they can be helpful in defending good things. Like I said, I just think people like go too hard, like they die on this hill as if it's like like they're waiting for their movie moment. Like, oh man, like I can't wait for the U.S. government to step into my lawn. I'm gonna open up hit the button, the bed's gonna flip down, and we're gonna go to I don't know. It just feels really crazy to me.
Yeah, if we're
I do
in a
think
one-to-one scenario, it
Vito,
would probably.
I'm gonna hear from the door says don't talk much. Don't worry.
Sorry.
okay. Look, Fabian keeps bringing militaries back to the US, which is just really odd. I don't think there's a good argument for having like militias in a nuclear superpower. It's inherently a defensive thing. If you get invaded, like you already have that deterrent of nukes. Militias don't win wars; they deter occupation because they just make it really, really hard to do. But a better deterrent is nukes. So
We're
we
talking
already
about
have that.
internal
We
things
don't
right now.
really need militias
Yeah,
added to this.
You
but
keep going to that.
I think that the more interesting argument is to ask, like Stardust, like, are you saying that Ukraine shouldn't have militias or supply militias, or countries that aren't part of a defensive pact with a nuclear superpower or a nuclear superpower
I'm not
themselves?
anti-militia. That's never
Okay.
been my thing. I'm just anti like glorifying something that is not does not have all these advantages that we're making it out to be.
Okay, but do you think that glorifying something like this in these countries would help with recruitment rates into militias
But why
in
are
an
we talking
occupation?
about glorifying it when we're talking about strategically about with the U.S. being invaded?
I've very
There's no
specifically
reason
taken
for
us
it. If we're talking
away from
about
the
it just
US.
from a
I
logical
very
sense, there's no
specifically
reason for us
took
to be
us away from the
glorifying it.
US.
We should be
My
talking in
specific
reality.
my specific question to you was in countries that are not a nuclear superpower or aligned in a defensive pact with a nuclear superpower. Ukraine is one of these countries. I'm saying in those countries, do you think it's a good idea to push for recruitment into militias, to push for militia training by your armed forces,
Sure,
to
but that's
push
not
for
necessarily
militia culture?
glorifying it. That's
No, but we're
if you're,
talking about
it's not necessarily
enhancing
glorifying it.
militia
When you're
culture.
trying to recruit people, it's important to be honest, right?
Mhm.
Keep up the morale, but be honest about what these hardships are going to be. And when we're talking about specifically the scope of the question, which is the U.S. getting invaded, we shouldn't be talking about militias as if it's they have all these advantages over being part of the military. It just seems silly to me.
Okay,
Yeah,
but
in fact, I think Ukraine understands this too, because after the
Yeah.
the 2014 shooting with Crimea, they incorporated militia groups into their National Guard, right?
Mhm.
Because they understand that, hey, these militia groups are more effective when they're part of our traditional military.
Yeah, well, the one question I want to ask you, Stardust, just a yes or no on this one, if you could. Are you for or against militia culture in countries that aren't a nuclear superpower or have a defensive pact with a nuclear
What
superpower?
is militia culture?
Well, that's the entire thing that we're talking about here, right?
Wow,
A
that's a cop out.
glorification.
What
Yeah,
in-
that's
That's
what
the
is a
entire
what
thing
in-
we're
the
talking about.
glorification
The idea of
of
militia culture is having militias set up in your country and thinking that that's a positive thing. So working towards getting
when have
militias,
I been
working towards
against
arming
militias?
Wait,
civilians,
hold on. But
working
what in,
towards.
When have
but
I been
the-
against militias, the duelist?
I
okay, but
don't know. That's why I'm asking you.
Duelist,
I
wouldn't
have
this
stated
depend
how many
entirely?
times have I stated in this conversation
Uh-huh.
that I'm not against militias?
Okay.
How many times do I
So,
have to say that? Do
so
I
are
need to
you?
repeat it like 3 more times for you guys?
Yeah. So
Yes,
what's the
please.
issue
I
with?
am not against militias.
Okay.
I'm pro Second Amendment. I just don't think we should be glorifying them.
Yeah, it's like this
In
whole
what countries? Do you
conversation.
think we
We
shouldn't
had
be
people
glorifying them
arguing
around
Okay,
the
the
world
duelist,
about
or in the U.S.?
QB.
Dillis, I think okay.
Anywhere.
So I think this should
Be
obviously
realistic.
depend entirely on the country that we're speaking about, because there
Uh-huh.
are lots of countries on this planet right now where there are active civil wars because militia groups rose up against the government that couldn't put them down effectively, right? So if we have situations like this where there are like religious fundamentalist groups forming militias, I don't think we should be encouraging that kind of shit. I don't think those governments should be allowing these people to form these groups.
Yeah, but that's an anti-militia stance.
I think it seems to be the case that a lot of these countries.
But that isn't the stance that Stardust
I think these
has,
countries.
so,
I'm asking you, right? Because you're speaking as if these militias are a good thing just across the fucking board, right? But obviously, if we were to look to, one of the countries in Africa that we could look at Somalia, the Congo, look at Sudan. There are militia groups here that rose up and has started claiming chunks of territory and fucking torturing the civilian population, right? Because they have the ability to do it, because they have the weaponry to do it. So if you're saying, hey, should we just support militia culture, whatever the fuck that is, I'm going to say no, right? Because it's way more common for these groups to rise up against local governments, local communities, and to try to like force people into their religion or their political ideology or whatever the fuck it is, right? So given that that's way more fucking common than a militia group defending a country from some authoritarian government, whatever the fuck, I'm going to say, hey, no, we shouldn't have militia group.
So now we're changing the conversation to fucking failed states and how like warlords rise up in failed states. Like
I don't think around the globe, Scott.
I don't think that's relevant to the
topic.
I don't think that's relevant.
So hold on. Hold on. I think there might be a relevance here, Scott. Because think about it. No, just consider this for a moment, right? What Doobie is trying to say, right? He's talking about like the stability of a state, right? The stability of a state is going to have a great influence in whether you want armed groups running around, right? If you are a state that is falling apart, right, that has a lot of political contestation about like the territory and everything like that, well then armed groups are going to be like your enemy, right? Like whatever standing army you have, they're going to be fighting those guys, right? And the calculus changes maybe in the states where there's a lot of political stability. And it's unlikely, at least as of now, right? I don't think maybe forever, but as of now, it's unlikely that these militias would be ever able to contend, right? They don't have like political backing, they don't have popular support, they don't have any of that stuff, right? So I think that does relate as to at least what Doobie's trying to do.
Okay, so do you have a legitimate concern that militia groups in the United States will present like a clear and present danger to the population and start taking over shit and converting people?
Yeah, I think I do. No, I'm not saying that I expect a militia group to ever be able to topple the government. I don't think that could ever happen in the United States.
Okay.
But I think
coming from a standpoint where you believe that having militias is a dangerous thing in America because they'll start taking over towns and
you didn't let me finish the statement. You didn't let me finish the statement, right? So I just said that I don't expect a militia group in the United States to be able to topple the government. But what I do expect from some of these militia groups, especially like the far right ones and far left ones, is that they will enact like terrorism or against like local populations, against the government, against government officials, right? Because we've seen this dozens of times throughout our history. You go back to the Weather Underground. You could talk about the fucking I mean, you brought him up earlier, Timothy McVeigh, right? And their fucking compound where they were gathering all these weapons in Waco and shit, right? Like they're in the you're gonna laugh about that, of course.
I'm laughing about Waco.
Of course,
continue.
Of course, okay. So I think again, it's way more common for that kind of shit to happen in the United States, for people to get weapons, to form little groups, and then to hurt people, right? For some political or religious like belief. So that's what I'm worried about when it comes to militias in the United States.
So you think that there are no problems with the American military or police?
I don't think I ever said that, but I don't think the answer to that problem is give weapons to a bunch of weirdos who run around the forest every weekend and have them shoot the police. Like obviously,
but I'm saying is that you depend upon protection from the state forces, right?
Right. I'm sorry. What was that question?
You depend upon the protection from the state forces without a militia and without a well-armed population, right? Like police, firemen, the army, etc. Right. So if you're gonna use examples of how like militia groups can cause acts of violence, right? Then it's perfectly legitimate to say, yeah, that happens sometimes. Also, so do the police and military cause acts of violence against people. So,
But
so your
when you
argument
take
is
into account the amount of
danger-
interactions that the police have with the populace across this country every
Mhm.
day, right?
Mhm.
It's a tiny percentage of these interactions, a very tiny percentage, where anything bad happens, anything like untoward happens. Right? So
Well, I don't know about
I'm
bad
okay
or
with those.
untoward, but if we want to
Now,
define it, it's like,
I'm
let's say deaths. I agree with
We
you.
also have to
citizens
account for
also-
like the level of
what I'm not okay
the
with
level
is,
of training.
like groups like fuck, what are the name? The Oath Keepers, or was it
Keepers?
the
Yeah,
3%ers
Oath
who,
Keepers.
after Biden got elected, right, they made this public statement about how he wasn't their president. And these are people who have military style weapons. They train regularly. There are thousands of them. I'm not comfortable with people like that who are saying that they don't accept the president of the United States having the ability to have this kind of weaponry in our country.
But obviously, that's like to do with the type
People
of
can't
militia,
have
right? Like,
disagreements,
like
be armed.
it's so obviously that's to do with like the type of militia, right? So I don't think anyone's going to disagree with the existence of like the militias in Rojava, right? Like obviously those militias probably should exist, but then there might be more of a contention with like those dipshit militias in like Czechia and Slovakia that call themselves like the border militia, where they just stand there looking for asylum seekers to fucking point guns at and turn them back the other way, right? So obviously that type, whatever, like. Yeah, but that's more to do with like the ideology rather than the fact that it's a militia, right?
I mean, like, yeah, a lot of these militias, even in the United States, tend to have very extremist views, right? So, I mean, that's probably a huge part in this, right? There was the Oath Keepers was a great example. I'm not against them, but there is a high likelihood, it seems, for these groups, if they are politically motivated, to do things that are not going to benefit the local population. And the local population, they voted for their representatives. They voted, for the local politicians who decide where the funding goes and where the training goes and what type of training and things like that. And yeah, I think that when you consent to that local government, that local politician, and you know who your police are, and those police interact with your community on a pretty regular basis, they may not be perfect. They may be far from perfect, but at least you know that those are the people in your community. You don't know if these people who are in these militias are going to have your best interests at heart, or if they're just serving their own political interests.
Also,
So what
the
do we think
original
about-
question
sorry.
was from the do list was, should we glorify militia culture? And in situations where a militia is for some reason absolutely justified and needed, I think that its purpose will be justified, but it doesn't need glorification. Even in the best circumstances, and typically when somebody wants a militia to be needed, it's usually those extremist groups. So I just don't see any circumstance where glorification is necessary or justified.
So what do we
I
think
don't know.
about
I
the?
think if you look at
sorry.
stuff like ISIS's recruitment, it was very effective, very good. Even took people from other countries in the world, and it was based on like glorification of.
Was that
militias
good?
and
Should I
stuff like
support
this.
that? And am I supposed to support ISIS now?
You're supposed to support their recruitment methods. If,
I mean, they're
if
good
it
at
worked,
recruiting
it
people, but I don't
worked.
need to
Yeah.
glorify it.
No, but you don't. No, but they glorified it to recruit people. I'm not saying you have to glorify it or
Well,
anything.
yeah,
I'm
if we want
just
to talk
saying
about
that when
effective
we
ways
look
to
at
recruit people
militias,
into a
agreeing with
militia,
that.
that's a
glorify
separate
stuff.
discussion. Like, that's a separate question. You're answering a question you didn't ask. You ask if we should glorify a militia culture,
Yeah.
not is glorification an effective way to recruit people to your
Yeah,
militia.
and I'm saying we should because it's an effective way of recruiting people into. I'm saying
Why
that
do
this
we
is
want
the
to
benefit
recruit
of
people into
glorifying.
militias? Why is
Wait, hold
recruiting
on. Wait,
people
when
into
you look
militias
at-
good?
Only in
Why is
countries-
ISIS a
only in
good
countries-
way?
When you look at
anyways?
Only in
the type of
countries-
people, hold on. When you look at the type of people that ISIS was able to recruit, why the fuck would we think that it's a good thing that they were able to pull in like incels and like
Preying
people with like
upon
sociopathic tendencies, like preying
People who
upon
have
like
no parental
exactly.
figures, preying upon people who are vulnerable. That's fucked up. They
Yeah, because it's
recruited
better than having
kids.
nobody.
Okay, but
Yeah, 'cause
how
those
would
are the
you
ones
how
you
would you
get when you
apply
glorify
how would you
militias,
apply
right?
that kind of recruitment method to like a U.S. militia? There
I
are ways to
wouldn't-
do it.
I
I
wouldn't
can think
advocate
of
for a
lots of them
US
right now.
militia.
I can
I
think of
advocate
like
against
lots
US
of white
militias.
nationalist groups who use the same kind of language that ISIS does when they're trying to recruit dudes, right? But I don't think that's something we should glorify.
Okay, I advocate against U.S. militias.
Then
I
okay,
think that there's no
so
reason
where
whatsoever that a nuclear superpower
where in
should
the
have a
world do you
militia.
think it'd be reasonable for a militia to use the kind of recruitment tactics that I just said?
Probably like Ukraine. I think that Ukraine can use very like heavy propaganda that's anti-Russian and glorifying the fight that they're doing against Russia. And I think that that would be an effective way to recruit into the militia. And I think
Okay,
it'd be an
so can you
effective
give
way
me an
to stop the
example of
Russian
a country that isn't
occupation.
currently being invaded?
Not at the moment, no.
Okay.
How's Rojava doing? Would they be a good example? They're not really a country, but you know. I don't know to what extent they glorify their militia culture, but like they do see it, like that they have like an obscene amount of like a percentage of women in their militias as well, because it's like, I guess the point is like purpose, right? And also just that like they're a group of people that need to defend themselves like all the time, basically.
I don't know. It might be a good idea
Oh
for
yeah,
Latvia to start getting some
if it
militia
looks
people.
like if it looks
What do
like
we
your
think about
country is
the,
going to be invaded, or you're
No, they're
currently
probably
being
fine, to be
invaded,
honest.
then I think glorifying militia culture is a very good thing that you can do, because you need to recruit as many people into the militias as possible to stop the imminent occupation of your country.
Okay,
Sure,
but
but that's
like,
not the only reason
if
for
you're
militias to exist. You keep coming from the position of invasion which
Yeah,
I
it's
get
a
it. That's
defensive
important.
thing.
That's literally
I'm
the
saying-
topic.
But I'm
The
saying
topic
that,
requires like that.
no,
the topic
we're
says for
talking
local
about
defense.
Okay,
yes, but I'm
so
saying you
to
can defend
clarify,
yourself
No,
from
you-
internal.
I don't think you should form a militia to invade another country.
We're
I don't
not.
think
No,
militias
we're not.
should
No.
be-
You're missing me. I'm talking about whenever people. I guess like y'all never had a militia conversation before. When from a
Really,
United
Nick?
States perspective, whenever we talk about militias, we're talking about an internal thing. We're talking about something, an insulated event against like the people versus the government. I'm not talking
that's
about
not the
another
topic.
government. But,
No,
but
so what
it's
you-
about
what you
militia.
keep
Grounding
arguing-
people for not being off topic.
No, here's what you keep arguing that invasion justifies militia, and then using that to justify militias that are existing in the United States when we're not being invaded.
Correct.
Well, probably
No,
because
I don't
have,
justify militias in the United States, because the United States isn't in threat of being invaded. I think that this is a great justification for no militias in the United States, because militias are a defensive thing, and the United States isn't
okay,
going to be
Dolus,
invaded by anyone.
maybe
There's no
here
reason to
maybe I
have
found
militias in
the
US.
ratio. So if you like a country is like under threat of like being invaded by a neighboring country, wouldn't it be way more reasonable, right, rather than glorifying like quote unquote militia culture, for that government and those people to glorify military culture and people being recruited and joining the military, the formal armed forces, to fight against an invader?
Yeah,
They
this
can
isn't
learn
a zero-sum
professional
game.
tactics, professional training. Like why would you like not do that? Why would you
Because you need
do the
There
militia
are
thing
people
at
who
all?
won't serve
Why
in
would
the
you promote
army
the militia
that
thing
will
at
serve in the
all?
militia.
Why? Why do you think people would serve in
There are
the militia,
many
but not the army?
different personal reasons that people would do these different things, and you should be arming your civilians as well. Even people who aren't actively joining militias, just arm your civilians. Maybe at some point they'll take
but
up arms
typically-
against the occupiers.
Ideally, they wouldn't be in civilians.
Typically-
If you're about to be invaded, we should now like there should be a draft. We're all military now. Like we're all acting.
Yeah, and
for the-
typically people
the
who would
military.
join a
Well,
militia,
you
who would
don't-
join a
you don't
militia, but
wanna-
wouldn't join the military if they have this kind of belief in military warfare and shit like that. They're going to be people whose ideology conflicts with the like governing ideology of the state that they're in, right? Typically, right? This is why, for example, you have the Azov battalion that everybody's so upset about. Why you have groups in the United States like the Oath Keepers. Why you have groups that like these militia groups that form all over Africa and the Middle East, right? That end up rising against their governments. Right? So I don't know. I don't know if we
Doobie, doesn't that prove your
people.
point? Doesn't
It
that
could
prove
just
your
be-
point? Like there are going to be people who wouldn't join the military, but would join a militia group for the defense of their home and their community, right? You just said there are going to be people with different ideas that might not want to join the military because they have ideological differences or they have any other differences. But at the end of the day, when fucking Russia comes kicking down fucking doors, some of those people, like, again, the duelist is not saying that it's a zero-sum game that like everyone must go join the militia because militia better when defending. What he's saying is we should have both, because that would be the most effective way of repelling an invader, barring mutually assured destruction from
He's
having
not
a
saying-
pact with.
But he's not saying we should have both. He's saying that if your country
Yes, he
is-
did. He said that.
He said that if your country is currently being invaded or is going to be invaded sometime in the near future, then you should have militia groups. Which at that point, it sounds like you're saying
I will let the duelist repeat what he said.
You should just be giving weaponry. He just agreed with that statement. Which at
No, he
that point,
didn't.
I think you might as well say that you should give weaponry to everybody in the country, right? If you're at that level, because if you're already being invaded or you think you're going to be invaded pretty soon, it would probably be reasonable to just give guns to everybody, right? If that's
Yeah, I think you should arm your civilians, and I think you should try to get militia groups as well, and I think you should be drafting people into your military as well. Do be kind of remembering that if you draft all of your people into the military and then you lose, you're losing a lot of people here. Whereas civilians don't necessarily have to take up arms at any point in time, neither do militias. Like, they can fight 5, 6, 7, 8 years down the line. There's just more things here, and they have like different command structures that you can't just like. So, for example, in the United States, the president is the commander of the army, right? And if you could enact a government and you could overthrow a government, and you could get your own president into the United States, you now have like command lines down the army that are easier to implement and put your own people into. When you're talking about like local militias, like I could have like 2 friends, and that's our like 3-man, like this is what we do, we train together, we're ready for guerrilla warfare. Like, you'd now have to replace 1/3 of the population with your own figurehead to control these local militia groups. Like, there's benefits to having a stand-up army with a very clear chain of command, and then there's also benefits to having like militias that are different chains of command. But again, militias are not a very good defense strategy if you can have nukes or be in a defensive pact with a nuclear country, or, you know, be at peace with your allies.
My chat is super mad at me because I didn't stress this point earlier, but one of the main advantages of having a militia group is that they hide within the population. And so in order for an invading force to be able to kill and to be able to occupy an area that has militia groups hiding within the civilian population, they have to kill all of the civilian population. And so unless they're invading with the intent of killing all of the population, which is possible, but usually not likely in most scenarios, that this is another advantage.
Sure. So one thing I'll say is that's probably the only advantage that you've brought up that seems valid to me. All of the other advantages that you've brought up thus far are things that the military can easily do. Okay?
Yeah, no.
Wait, let me fucking finish. Okay? Ramble fuck 1 over here and Ramble fuck 2 over here, from fucking Dr. Seuss, okay? I don't know what the fuck's going on over here, but I think it's a little bit presumptuous for Mr. Ramble fuck 2 over here to say that he thinks that I haven't paid attention to the fucking topic when you guys have gone off topic this entire time. And God forbid that I try to contribute to the conversation and say, hey, that doesn't seem a little bit right. Oh, well, it seems like you haven't engaged with the topic. Shut the fuck up, okay? No, absolutely not. The only point that you have made that it seems valid to me that I thought about is that, yes, they can easily fit in with the civilian population. As far as guerrilla warfare goes, that's just a defensive tactic. And anybody can do that. Any organized military can do that. The National Guard can do that. It doesn't take a militia specifically to do that. Am I anti-militia? No. But do I think that there are all these magical... Militias are so magical and they have all these advantages? Probably not. The only advantage I can really see is that they fit in with the population.
I want to say something to Doobie, because Doobie, you keep talking, you spoke about it earlier, and it seems like you spoke about it again, which is this idea that the local military can recruit, the local military can bring people in and train. And you talked about like the militias that were, I guess, like superior because our militias are just PTSD soldier losers and their militia are like badass Iraqi soldiers or whatever. Anyways, you talked about how they could be consumed of the general population just as easily as a militia could, but That's one of the justifications for militias in America, right? When in the Federalist Papers, the reason they argue for the second, one of many reasons they argue for the Second Amendment, which is a well-regulated militia, which does not mean regulated like the way we use the term today, but of course means regulated as in well-organized militia groups have a right to exist in America, and we have an express purpose for that. And some of that was to go against the tyranny of the government, but it was also for the idea of self-defense if the nation needed to bring people from the civilian population and draft them or bring them into being soldiers, that they would be parts of well-regulated militia, that they would already have an idea of how to shoot firearms, that they would have an idea of certain tactics and gear, that they would have an idea of command structures. So part of the justification for the Second Amendment in America is the very idea that well-regulated militias are able to have a civilian population that is ready to go to war, even if that means bringing them into a military structure.
Scott, do you think it's more likely that the United States of America is invaded by somebody and then occupied long term? Or do you think it's more likely that militias in the United States could actually do revolts against local government or federal governments in the United States and cause some sort of civil unrest?
Almost certainly the second, given the present circumstance.
Yes,
but I'm an anarchist, so I might like that. But that being said, I don't have a crystal ball, right? So, I mean, tomorrow China could invent some shit that nobody ever heard of that like stops the ability of nuclear warheads to ever be dropped. And then all of a sudden we'd be like, holy shit, this changes the game. Mutually assured destruction's off the table.
Yeah, but I think if your more likely scenario is civil unrest, then you probably shouldn't be wanting lots of militias in your country.
Yeah, but I'm pro civil unrest.
Okay.
Doobie?
What do we think about the?
Well, yeah, and
No,
I think that's
sorry.
why.
Doobie, then Loner Box. Sorry, I didn't realize you were going to jump in.
I think that's why what Scott said just fell flat. To be honest,
because you don't want to engage with the merit of the argument itself.
No, because I'm starting to engage with it. Right, just calm down. But this idea that the local ANCAP militia group, or the local far right weirdo militia group, right, or the Antifa militia group that does kung fu in the park, whatever the fuck, that these people would be open to being incorporated by the U.S. fucking military, even if an invasion happens, seems kind of ridiculous to me. It seems like these people have massive ideological difference. A lot of these people want the government to fall apart. A lot of these people would prefer it if the United States were invaded, right? So, with some of these groups, I wouldn't trust them not to help the enemy if an invasion happened, right? So and the fact that you want civil unrest, you want revolution at some fucking point, just again, further fuels a fire that we should not have these people having this kind of military weaponry. We shouldn't allow them to organize the way they do. And to be very clear, I think most people in militias in the United States are LARPers who probably were in the military, fell out for whatever reason, probably have PTSD or some kind of knee injury or whatever the fuck, or they're policemen who can't let go of their hero complex, right? So they run around the woods with their friends on the weekend and put on stupid uniform.
So your argument is they because they wouldn't want it and they'd help the enemy and they're all dumb.
I think no, you're not listening. I didn't say every single militia group in the United States would help the enemy. I'm saying that I wouldn't put it past some of these groups, like an Antifa group, for example, like some like far right, like white ethno-nationalist group, for example, right? Like the fucking KKK has militia groups, right? Like I wouldn't trust these people not to rise up against the United States if Russia invaded or some other country invaded, right? So I don't think they should have access to this weaponry. I don't think we should allow them to be organizing. I don't think we should allow people like you. I don't think we should allow people like you and your friends to get together and train to take down the government. I don't think that's a reasonable situation.
Yeah. So you believe, right? Your whole argument was a lot of ad homs on militias, right? But you believe that militias that your argument is that most of them wouldn't join the military, and that a population that is trained under the premises of understanding a well-regulated militia is a portion of the population, like, you know, teaching kids how to shoot in school like we used to do until the 60s or in the 70s, you know, like things like that having a culture, as the duelist talked about, of acceptance of militia culture and things like that, that all of that is invalidated because some extremists, you think, in the invasion that occurs from some country would actually support that country, even though most of these militia groups that are right wing that you describe are ultra nationalists. So the idea that they'd help an enemy invader take over the country is fucking absurd. But like, do you have any actual arguments, or do you just like to make fun of people?
You're
Doesn't
pretending.
the American
you're
far right
pretending
have like a
is-
strange affection
You're
for
pretending
Putin right
again
now?
that I said every single group would do this, right?
No, I'm
Obviously
not.
Yes, you are, because
No, I'm
what
not.
you just said that, right? You're saying you just said that hey, well, most of these groups are like far right or like nationalists, whatever the fuck. So the idea that they'd rise up against the government or they wouldn't help the government during an invasion is like silly or whatever the fuck. Like,
Right, but
I
you
agree
didn't
with that.
I'm engaging with your attack and your silliness.
However,
Doobie, stop being
these
such a
same
snake,
groups,
dude. Come on.
I'm not being a
You're-
snake. You do this
you're
every single
frog
time.
completely
You do
away.
this every single time you get caught in some bullshit. You start calling me a snake or whatever the fuck. Just calm down. Look, what I'm saying is that these groups, given that they have their own command structures and they've rather than join the military, they've intentionally set themselves apart from the military. And some of these groups have thousands of members. I don't think a lot of these people are going to be willing to be incorporated into the U.S. military, right? And because my major concern with U.S. militias isn't that they're going to topple the government. I don't think the U.S. is going to be invaded anytime soon. My major concern with U.S. militias is civil unrest, that thing that you want, right? The thing that you prefer is that them doing terrorist attacks and hurting people over some like crazy bullshit, right? So given that that's the case, right, I don't think we should be funding these people or we should be glorifying any of this shit. I think we should take away
So
their
again-
weapons, and I think we shouldn't allow them to organize.
Again, right? I brought up the idea that the idea that of the Second Amendment, right, was argued and defended for, was the idea that a well-regulated militia in the culture allowed for a population to be able to defend themselves in the event of an invasion, as well as to be consumed and better trained, right? Then you said that these groups might fight against the government and it's just bad. So you didn't engage with the idea of the
Okay.
general population being trained. And if in what you're saying, in order for your argument to be logically true, then you would have to make the argument that either A, a majority of them would help invaders, or that B, enough of them would have to help the invaders that it would offset the positive of having trained individuals that could be consumed into the military. Those are the only two possible arguments.
Yeah, I feel like you're misrepresenting. So first off, I disagree with the founders.
Misrepresenting is
I was gonna be like four back and forth.
Listen, I disagree. I disagree with
Can I just say something
the
real quick?
founders really quickly. I disagree with the founders on a ton of shit. I think most of them were jackasses, right? So
Not
appealing to
relevant.
them isn't helpful. However, I think you're misrepresenting the reason that they wanted these militias. My understanding is that they wanted these militias because they didn't want to fund like a standing army, like a national army, right? So rather than having that, they were supporting militia groups in individual states and individual communities, right? So if an invasion happened, they could organize these existing militia groups, right? Not that they could incorporate them into a standing army that they currently have.
They had a standing army since 1789.
So
Small, very, very
okay.
small. And you're right that it was cheaper and more effective.
So okay,
But that wasn't the argument from a moral perspective from the Federalist Papers. You're misrepresenting
moral
the
perspective.
thing again.
sorry, Loner Box. Did you get a chance to say anything? I forget if I
Yeah.
And
Sorry,
then- and then after
someone
that,
said my
bam.
mic was getting too high. Is it better now?
you were fine before. I didn't have a problem.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I think the thing about the I don't know. Given the way that the far right in America are like strangely enamored with Putin right now, I wouldn't put it past the far right militia groups to be okay with Russia invading. But anyway, what do we think about the ultra Second Amendment take that we just get more militias to like protect us from all the shit ones? You know, just get some like kind of people who might be wanted to keep the 3%ers and the oath keepers in line. You know, like the
Based.
good old days.
I
Black
think the
Panther
glorification
style.
of gun culture is the reason so many Americans die every year, and I'd like to stop doing it. I think
yeah,
we should not
quick-
glorify people shooting stupid toys in the forest and shit.
Quick question, Scott. Like, you keep appealing to like the 1700s, but I want to know what you feel on today's like militias. Do you think that the average militia group that we hear about in the United States is in favor, of being like swallowed up by the U.S. government, and if called to do so? Like, do you think that that's what they organize around? Like, we're here to be an extension for the United States government. If
America was invaded, probably.
No, I'm just saying in general. Do you think that they're like anti-establishment or like pro-establishment?
That does, but now you're talking about a completely different context, right? You're talking like one is about the idea of we're being invaded and we need to bolster our ranks, which is where the argument came from, right? Was because Doobie was making the argument that there's no need to have any recruitment into militias at all, that everything can just be recruited into the military, and that by recruiting into the militias during an invasion is like a silly thing because the military would be more effective. And then I was pointing out that part of the reason we have the Second Amendment and part of the reason we have a right to a well-regulated militia is in the event of an invasion, when we need these people, that these people already know how to use firearms, that they're already.
But let's talk about the United States, that we've already agreed invasion isn't the likely scenario for our militias. So let's talk about like what would likely happen with the United States militias.
Right, but now you're talking about a completely separate topic.
Then let's talk about that one. Then that's
okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Do I think that most right-wing militias that you guys hear about?
I think left-wing too. I'm not gonna like.
We said the ones we hear about, right? So
yeah.
We hear like sometimes we hear about John Brown Gun Club, but for the most part we hear about Oath Keepers and 3%ers, right? Like that's pretty much all we ever hear about. Which are a significant group in terms of militia size, but there's a ton of fucking militia groups. But if we're talking about these guys, do I think these guys are just waiting to get the draft letters from the military to become part of the military so that the military can force them to do whatever they want them to do? Of course fucking not.
Okay, that's fair. That's like I said, we don't have to go further than that. I just was curious. I thought you were gonna dot the nine, like, yeah, these guys are super pro establishment.
No, they're nationalists. Yeah. I was just making the argument that right-wing nationalist militia are probably not going to support fucking Putin if he invades, no matter how blue-pilled you think you are. Like, that's not going to fucking happen.
I don't disagree.
Yeah, I mean, unless quite enamored
unless they also believe that the democracy has been stolen because the election has been rigged, and the person in office right now isn't actually their president like the Oath Keepers do. That's really weird.
Yeah, because they say the Second Amendment is about like protecting
the governor of Michigan.
Because they say like the Second Amendment is about like protecting America.
That was the
from
FBI
tyranny,
that tried to kidnap the governor of Michigan, not militia groups.
I think that's interesting. Though. I mean, like if the invading force backed a contender, right? That's how these things work, right? Like a political contender. That's what we do. We'll train forces to back a political contender. So if the invading force did that, and then half the populace says this, the person who is president right now is not the actual president, and we want to do something about it. I mean, like, this is the scenario we face today, except that they don't have a foreign power willing to arm them and train them and send them up against the U.S. military, right?
No, I think you have to be extremely blue and on to like think that like Putin could come in and train right-wing militias to take over fucking Biden in the hopes that they'll get a real good president next time. Like a couple of LARPing teens online that like Putin because they think he hates gays.
I hear you.
It's like not really like them supporting.
I hear you.
That.
That's not realistic in this very moment. I get that. That's not realistic in this very moment. But if we're talking about a future scenario, right? Then we have everything else lined up. We have a populace, at least a portion of the populace, that does not believe that the person in office, right, the person heading the state, is legitimate. We have that same populace, at least a portion of them, who have no problem going with violent means, right? They talk about it all the time. They want to do it. Most of them, of course, are wipers and will never fucking actually, pick up a gun for that shit. But there are some people who would, right? We just don't have. We have a stable country and a powerful country that people don't technically want to go against. But like in that scenario, if things were a little bit different, a foreign power could come in and then give these people training and arm them, right?
Well, I would just say this. Is it possible? Yes. But I would just say that it's more likely that an ardent communist tanky becomes an ANCAP than an ultra-nationalist right-wing militia guy decides to take up arms against the state in the interests of a foreign power.
Yeah, but
it wouldn't be
that we assume.
It'd
I
be
think
it'd be
they
in the
already
interest
did
of the American democracy that they feel has
That's-
been stolen, right?
Yeah.
So like, you could easily make that case, I think, to a lot of these people.
Like
Yeah,
I said,
do-
like I said,
Interesting
that's
that we're
one-
making the
do
assumption.
you
Yeah,
think
I'm
the
pretty
fact
sure,
that
like-
the election
like,
was stolen was
foreign
like
power
part
is
of
not gonna-
Russian propaganda?
We're gonna top down
really
because you haven't
just
said
say-
anything in a long time. Don't go to Lilac. All right.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that a foreign power isn't gonna walk in and be like, "Yo, your government's not doing it for you. How about our government?" It would probably be something about, "Oh, hey, like we see that your like election was stolen. You know what? We can help you. We can help you by arming you, and we can help you take your government back. We'll like give you some training, and we'll provide some aid, and like we'll take over your government, and then you guys can put real leaders in power." It's like I would bet that a lot of like the like January Sixers type people would totally fall for rhetoric like that.
Yeah. Lilac.
I just think it's interesting that we're coming from the assumption, and actually, this is maybe one thing I agree with Scott on. I don't think that these far-right groups would knowingly choose to support a Russian invasion. But I do think that it's a weird assumption to be like, oh yeah, Russia would totally boast about that. That's not in line with how they've generally done things. And I think it's a fair assertion to make that the Russian troll farms and those weird like news sites that they set up and all the propaganda that they put out onto the internet that supports these far-right nationalist groups probably serves their interest if they're putting funding towards that. So I don't think that they would announce themselves, though.
That's a super fair point. I'll give you that. But I will also just add that it's more likely that the FBI will do that than Russia, since the FBI does do that.
Just like
Okay,
the
I mean, like if we're going to
FBI
talk about the
kidnapped
FBI, that's okay.
that governor.
Yeah, I'd
Right.
just like to say that like the oath
that was all
breakers
them.
were already
That's
affected
known.
by Russian propaganda that was put into the country. And one of the big things that like Russian propaganda pushes is the fact that the election is illegitimate. Whether or not you believe that for other reasons, and whether or not there are other parties who also believe this that aren't like Russia propaganda, this is what they push for, because this is part of destabilizing the West and destabilizing the United States. So saying that these people can't have their motives affected by these other countries is just like a really bad thing, because they were affected by those other countries, literally, in the case of the Oathbreakers.
Hey, just let me know when you guys are done with the blue and non-Russia conspiracy theory from 2016.
Sawdust.
I'm gonna go get a glass of water.
Was that a
Oh,
conspiracy
okay,
theory?
he's leaving. I wanted to ask him
Yeah,
more
let's say
about
like
the.
the FBI.
Passive aggressive. Anyway.
I wanted to ask him more about the governor being kidnapped by the FBI. That's wild.
I could answer it for you,
By the way,
Stardust.
sorry,
what he's
his
gonna
answer
say-
is the only bad things that ever happen are because of the FBI, and yeah.
Oh no, what he's gonna say is that that group, that
he's
militia
coming
group,
back.
was
Okay.
infiltrated by the FBI, and that they had been egged on to do it. Right, they've basically been set up for that whole sting. That would be his argument. I can tell you that right now.
What's up?
The FBI.
FBI Michigan.
When
governor.
when they orchestrated the Governor Whitmer
How
assassination.
did they orchestrate it?
They funded it. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to shuttle bus people around, because the people that were orchestrating it that weren't FBI assets didn't own cars, so they had to drive them to each other. And this is widely reported on. Like, what are you talking about? This isn't like a conspiracy theory. This is just a known fact that the FBI did it. It was the FBI agent that said,
Why, though?
because that's what the FBI does. They
But, like, why
find people
would
that
they?
they think might be potential terrorists, then they egg them on and give them funding so that they can then catch them in the act of terrorism. And then the FBI can say, hey, look how good a job we're doing stopping terrorism, when it's like half the fucking time it wouldn't have been a problem if they would have just stayed away from
I
it.
haven't read enough into this situation to have an opinion on it, but this is what
I'll
the
grab the
FBI did
BuzzFeed
against
article real quick
Muslims.
and just throw it in. Yeah.
Please do.
Oh, yeah, they do it all the time.
They did it against Muslims after 9/11, right? For a long time, they would go into those neighborhoods. They would find an individual who like seemed like a loner or whatever the fuck, right? And they would basically entrap them. They would, talk to them like, "Oh, aren't you angry about something?" "Yeah, I'm angry. I mean, I guess, right? Maybe angry at the U.S. "Yeah, you know what? Fuck the cops or something, right? Hey, here's a gun. Oh, thanks." Oh, and then they arrest them, they swarm. And then on the news they'll say, "We stopped the terrorist plot," right? It's gonna get blown up. Everyone's gonna die. We stopped this terrorist plot. That's exactly what they did to Muslim individuals. So, but again, I don't know enough about this particular incident to be able to make a statement there.
I feel like we
Yeah,
can
I'm
all
just-
agree
I'm
that the
throwing in chat for
FBI
you.
does shitty things.
Yeah, no,
Sure.
I'm throwing in. I just threw it in the chat in StreamYard, so anybody wants to check it out. It's
I just want to
BuzzFeed News.
I just want to
I
reiterate
actually
about
don't think that's shitty
like
at all.
I just want to reiterate about the fire militias. Like, you know, we can all look at the AFPAC thing where they were all chanting Putin. It's like, these guys aren't just LARPers. You know, they're well connected. They've got high levels of funding. They have friends in Congress. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm not going to say I'm 100% sure. I wouldn't put it past them to be okay with Putin. I mean, I don't know, maybe piss off one or two people by bringing this up, but like in the late 30s, like the French right wing had a slogan that was better Hitler than Blum. They preferred Hitler to their own president. So, yeah, you know, it's not like it wouldn't be the first time.